My name is Marion Cole. I'm 42 years old and I work as a forensic accountant, which is a fancy way of saying I spend my days finding the exact place where numbers stop telling the truth. I was standing in my sister-in-law Bridget's kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in March, holding a mug of coffee I hadn't asked for and didn't want, when she told me, in the same breezy tone she'd used to mention the weather, that she needed $4,100 by Friday or she was going to lose the deposit on Sophie's school. "It's not a big deal," she said, already turning back to the dishes in her sink, not even looking at me when she said it, as if the size of the request didn't require eye contact. "You guys have it. You always have it." I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at her, the way I look at a ledger when a number is technically balanced but something underneath it feels wrong. The kind of wrongness you can't point to yet, but that makes you slow down and check the formula one more time. Bridget had said this kind of thing to me before dozens of times across 9 years, and every single time I had found a way to make it work. I had told myself it was what family did. I had told myself Daniel's sister was struggling, that she'd had it harder than him growing up, that generosity wasn't supposed to come with a ledger of its own, that keeping score was a kind of smallness I didn't want to be guilty of. What I didn't know yet, standing in that kitchen with a mug going cold in my hand, was that 3 days earlier I'd received an email that would sit unread in my inbox for another 11 days before I finally opened it. An administrative email from an attorney I'd never heard of about an estate distribution I knew nothing about. And when I finally did open it, everything I thought I understood about my husband's family would collapse into a shape I could finally see clearly for the first time in 9 years. I want to tell you what that Tuesday actually looked like in detail, because the small details are the ones that matter here. Bridget's kitchen smelled like the vanilla candle she always burned, the expensive kind from the boutique downtown, the kind that cost $18 a jar. There was a stack of unopened mail on the counter beside the coffee maker. I noticed the way I notice things, that one envelope near the top had the return address of a collections agency, the corner just visible under a takeout menu she'd tossed carelessly over it. Sophie's school photos from the fall were taped to the refrigerator in a slightly crooked row, her gap-toothed 9-year-old smile in every frame. A single dirty wine glass sat by the sink from the night before. "I just need it for a couple weeks," Bridget said, drying her hands on a dish towel and finally turning to face me. "I'll pay you back the second my client invoice clears. You know how freelance is, everybody pays late." She smiled at me, the specific smile she used when she was asking for something, warm and a little conspiratorial, like we were two women who understood each other in a way the rest of the family didn't. I said yes to Bridget that day, like I always did. I transferred the money that night from our joint savings account, the one Daniel and I had built over 11 years of careful, unglamorous discipline. The account we'd told each other more than once was for someday, for the house renovation we kept talking about and never starting, for the trip to New Zealand we'd been planning since our honeymoon. I remember typing the transfer note for B will reimburse and hitting confirm, and feeling the small, familiar click of relief that comes from having solved a problem before it could become anyone else's crisis. I had no idea it would be the last time I would ever say yes to her without asking a single question first. 3 weeks later, I would be sitting at my own kitchen table at 11 at night with a binder full of documents in front of me, understanding for the first time in 9 years exactly what kind of family I had actually married into, and exactly what Sophie's school had really meant every single time Bridget had said those words to me. Welcome back. If you're new here, welcome, and if you've ever been the one everyone counts on to fix things, the one who gets called only when something's needed, not when something's wrong, then this story is for you. Stay to the end, because the woman who thought I was invisible had no idea how closely I'd been watching. If this resonates, drop a comment and let me know. I read everyone, and subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Rewind where it started. Let me take you back to where this really began, because you can't understand what happened in that kitchen without understanding the 9 years, and honestly, the 30-some years before that. I met Daniel Hartley when I was 31 at a conference in Denver, of all places. Two accountants finding each other in a hotel bar during a break in a compliance seminar. which is either the least romantic origin story you've ever heard or exactly the kind of practical, steady beginning that should have told me everything about the life we'd build together. Daniel is kind in a quiet way, reliable, the kind of man who remembers your coffee order after one time and never mentions that he remembered it. He proposed 2 years later on a Tuesday, not a special occasion at all, because he said he didn't want the moment to feel like a performance. He just wanted me to know. His family was different from mine. I grew up an only child of 2 public school teachers in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, where money was never discussed above a whisper, and everyone paid their own way as a matter of pride bordering on stubbornness. My mother used to say, "We don't borrow and we don't lend, that way nobody has to remember who owes who." I didn't fully understand what a gift that upbringing was until I watched, up close, what happens in a family that operates by the opposite rule. Daniel grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona with his younger sister, Bridget, in a house where money moved like weather, sometimes abundant, sometimes not, but always somebody else's problem to solve, and always somehow Bridget's crisis that got solved first. I remember Daniel telling me, early in our relationship, almost as a throwaway comment, that he'd worked through both of his college summers to pay for his own textbooks, while Bridget's tuition shortfalls. She went to a more expensive school, a smaller liberal arts college 2 states away, were quietly covered by a home equity loan his parents took out and never fully discussed with him. He said it without bitterness, the way you'd mention a fact about the weather in a city you used to live in. I didn't understand then how much that flatness in his voice was actually years of practiced acceptance. Bridget was 29 when I met her, 3 years younger than Daniel, and from the very first dinner I understood the shape of their family without anyone having to explain it to me. Frank and Carol, their parents, had spent 30 years building a story about their 2 children, and in that story Daniel was the steady one and Bridget was the sensitive one, which I would later understand was a euphemism that had been protecting Bridget since she was in elementary school, a soft label draped over a pattern nobody wanted to look at directly. I remember the first real crack of it, the first time I saw the machinery move in front of me instead of hearing about it secondhand. We were at Frank and Carol's for Thanksgiving, my second one with the family, and Bridget arrived 40 minutes late, visibly upset, mascara smudged in a way that looked almost deliberate, saying her car had been repossessed that morning. Carol immediately began crying at the table, right there over the mashed potatoes. Frank immediately began problem-solving, pulling out his phone to call someone he knew at a used car lot. Daniel, without being asked, without even seeming to think about it, quietly transferred $600 from our joint account before we'd even sat down to eat, just to get her through the week. Nobody asked why the car had been repossessed. Nobody asked what had happened to the money that was supposed to cover the payment. The only question anyone in that house seemed capable of asking was, how do we make this feel better for Bridget right now tonight before the turkey gets cold? I remember thinking, even then, sitting quietly at the edge of that table with a plate I'd barely touched, that's not a family solving a problem. That's a family performing a ritual they've performed so many times they don't even see it as a choice anymore. The second memory that stayed with me was smaller, but it told me more, and it happened only a few months into knowing Bridget. She was 30, unemployed between graphic design jobs, and she asked to borrow my laptop for an afternoon to work on a resume while I was visiting for a weekend. When I got it back 3 days later, she'd kept it far longer than the afternoon she'd promised. There was a strange charge pending on a shopping site I didn't recognize, logged in through my saved password for $89. When I asked her about it, gently, genuinely more confused than accusatory, she looked at me with real, wounded hurt in her eyes and said, "Wow, I didn't realize I needed permission to be in this family." I apologized. I actually apologized to her for asking a completely reasonable question about my own laptop and my own money. I remember driving home that weekend, turning the exchange over and over in my mind, trying to figure out at what point, exactly, I had become the one who owed an apology. That was the third pattern, and it took me years to name it properly. Bridget didn't just ask for things. She made refusing feel like cruelty, and she made noticing feel like an accusation. Every boundary I tried to set got reframed, instantly and fluidly, as evidence that I didn't understand family, that I was the outsider who'd married in, the cold one, the one who kept score in a family that prided itself on never needing to. I want to be fair here because this isn't a story about a villain twirling a mustache, and I don't think it would be honest or useful to anyone watching if I told it that way. Bridget had genuinely had a harder run than Daniel in some ways. She'd struggled with an eating disorder in her 20s that the family rarely spoke of directly, referencing it only in oblique phrases like "that hard stretch" or when she wasn't doing well. She'd been engaged once at 26 to a man named Tyler who left 3 weeks before the wedding and took the deposit money, $11,000, all of it from Frank and Carol's savings, with him when he went. She was, by every account I gathered over the years, someone who had genuinely been hurt more than once in ways that would leave marks on anyone. What I didn't understand yet, what I wouldn't fully understand for 9 more years, was that being hurt and being honest are not the same thing, and a family that confuses the two will quietly bankrupt itself, one gentle favor at a time, to avoid ever finding out which is which. A note on how I kept track of myself. Before I take you through the years themselves, I want to explain something about how I actually lived inside this pattern, because I think it matters for understanding everything that follows. I am not, by nature, a suspicious person. I didn't enter my marriage looking for reasons to distrust my husband's family, and for the first year or two, I genuinely didn't have any. What happened instead was slower and in some ways harder to catch, a gradual, almost imperceptible recalibration of what I considered normal, one small request at a time, until behavior that would have seemed alarming to me at 29 felt, by the time I was 38, almost unremarkable, just part of the texture of being married into this particular family. I think that's true of most people who end up years deep in a pattern like this one. Nobody hands you the whole shape of it on day one and asks if you'd like to sign up. It arrives in pieces small enough to accept individually, and it's only much later, when you finally lay all the pieces out side by side, that you can see the shape they were quietly building the entire time. Escalation arc year 1. The pattern started small, the way these things always do, so small that naming it out loud at the time would have felt paranoid, even cruel. 6 months after Daniel and I married, Bridget called me directly, not Daniel me specifically, which I noted even then without quite understanding why it mattered, to ask if I could float her $700 for a security deposit on a new apartment. She'd pay it back in 3 weeks, she said, once her freelance invoices cleared from a branding project she'd just finished for a boutique hotel chain. "You're so good with money," she told me, her voice warm through the phone, almost admiring. "I trust you more than the bank. Honestly, banks make you feel like a criminal for needing help." That line did something to me that I didn't fully register until years later. It flattered the exact part of me that took quiet pride in being competent, in being the person who could be trusted with things, the person other people's chaos didn't touch. I said yes. The money was never mentioned again, not by Bridget, and when I brought it up once at a family dinner 8 months later, almost as a light joke, not really by anyone else either. Carol changed the subject to Sophie's upcoming preschool registration with a speed that, looking back, felt almost practiced. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table in a way that meant, let it go, not because he agreed with what was happening, but because he'd spent his whole life learning that letting it go was cheaper in every sense than the alternative. That's the machinery of it, if I'm honest with you now, looking back from where I stand today, the machinery I couldn't see clearly until I was standing far enough outside it. Every family has a currency it trades in, and in the Hartley family, the currency wasn't money. It was harmony, a specific, brittle kind of harmony that depended entirely on nobody ever asking the follow-up question. Money was just the thing they spent to buy it, over and over, and I was, without ever agreeing to the job, without ever being asked whether I wanted it, the family's primary and most reliable lender. Escalation arc year 2. By the second year, I had stopped keeping a mental tally, mostly because keeping one made me feel petty, small, unfamily-like. The exact thing Bridget's laptop comment had taught me, without either of us ever saying it out loud, that I wasn't allowed to be. But the accountant in me couldn't fully switch off, no matter how many times I told myself to relax, to be generous, to stop counting. I remember the exact moment I started keeping a private note in my phone. It was March, and Bridget had asked to borrow $1,100 for a car repair. The same car, I would later realize, that had already been repossessed and recovered the year before under circumstances nobody had ever explained, promising repayment the second my freelance client pays me, and I found myself, almost against my own will, opening the Notes app on my phone in the bathroom of her apartment, running the tap so the sound would cover what I was doing, and typing, March 14, $1,100, car repair, repay, unclear. I didn't tell Daniel I was keeping the note. I told myself it wasn't about tracking Bridget. It was about tracking myself, making sure I still remembered what was actually true, in a family where the truth had a way of getting quietly rewritten within a week of anything happening, softened at the edges until it fit the shape everyone had agreed without ever discussing it to believe. That same year, Sophie was born, Bridget's daughter, and the first grandchild on the Hartley side, arriving 3 weeks early on a Sunday morning in October. Sophie is, without exaggeration, one of the best things that happened in my adult life, and I want you to understand that clearly before this story gets harder, because everything that follows happened alongside real love, not instead of it. She had Bridget's dark curly hair and somehow, from the very start, none of the family's talent for rewriting reality. When Sophie was 18 months old, she would toddle over and put both her small hands flat on my face when I looked upset, which I now understand toddlers do to everyone, a reflex more than a comfort, but which felt at the time, sitting on Carol's living room floor with a diaper bag digging into my hip, like being told the truth by the only completely honest person in the room. I bring this up now because I want you to understand, this story has warmth in it, real warmth, not the performed kind. It isn't only about money and manipulation. Some of the best years of my life happened inside this family, and Sophie is a large part of the reason I stayed as patient as I did for as long as I did. That said, in the months after Sophie was born, Bridget asked Daniel and me for money 4 separate times. $340 for a crib after the one she'd registered for online turned out to be discontinued, $180 for a pediatric copay, $600 for help until maternity leave kicks in, and once memorably $200 because she just needed a night out one night to feel like a person again. I understood that last one. I did genuinely. New motherhood is brutal in ways nobody prepares you for, and I've never once judged her for needing a break from it. What I noticed, what I wrote in my phone that night, sitting in our own car in Bridget's driveway before I even started the engine, was that the request came framed not as a favor, but as an obligation and entitlement dressed up as vulnerability. You guys don't have kids yet, you don't get it, but you'll understand when you do. I remember thinking, staring at my own reflection faintly in the dark windshield, that's strange. That sentence isn't asking me for help, it's telling me politely and with a smile that I don't have standing to say no. Escalation arc Year 3. Year 3 is when the requests started arriving with a specific rhythm to them, a cadence I would come to recognize the way you recognize a song you've heard so many times you can predict the next note before it plays. In January, it was $400 for car insurance. Just this once I switched providers and the timing got weird. In April it was $900 for a dental thing. It's embarrassing, I don't want to get into it, which I now understand looking back at dental billing patterns I later cross-referenced out of professional habit more than suspicion. Almost certainly wasn't a real charge at all, or was a wildly inflated version of one. In July, it was the request that first made something in me go genuinely quiet and still, in a way none of the others had. $300 urgently on a Thursday night because Sophie, 18 months old at the time, had a fever and Bridget said she didn't have enough in the account to cover the urgent care copay. I didn't hesitate on that one. I drove the cash to her apartment myself at 9 at night, badly shaken by the idea of a sick baby and an empty account standing between them. When I got there, Sophie was asleep peacefully, no fever that I could detect with the back of my hand against her forehead, and Bridget was on the phone in the next room, laughing, planning what sounded like a weekend trip with a friend. I stood in that hallway for a long moment before I made my presence known. I didn't say anything about it that night. I told myself I'd misunderstood, that fevers spike and fall, that I wasn't a doctor and shouldn't act like one, that I was probably imagining a discrepancy that wasn't really there. But I wrote it down. July 9, $300 cash, Sophie, urgent care, unconfirmed, overheard trip planning same evening. I remember staring at that note for a full minute before I closed the app, feeling something I didn't have a name for yet, something between guilt for suspecting her and a colder, quieter feeling underneath the guilt that I wasn't ready to look at directly. Bridget's line that year, the one she used more than any other, was some version of, "I'd never ask if it wasn't important, you know that about me." She said it so often and with such consistent, practiced sincerity that I started to notice the sentence itself was doing work the actual situation often couldn't support on its own. It didn't describe a fact. It preempted a question. It closed a door before I'd even had the chance to knock on it. A small warmth. "I don't want you to think I spent 9 years keeping a silent ledger and gritting my teeth through gritted teeth smiles the entire time. There were real, unguarded, genuinely happy years in there too, and I think it's important to slow down here and give you one of them properly." When Daniel's father, Frank, had his knee replacement surgery in the spring of that third year, I was the one who drove him to physical therapy twice a week for 2 months, because it fit my schedule and because I genuinely liked the man. He had a dry, understated sense of humor that reminded me in the best way of my own father, and our 40-minute drives to and from the clinic became one of my favorite parts of that entire year. Frank never once in all that time asked me for money, not once. He asked me about my work instead, real questions, the kind that showed he'd actually been listening the last time I'd mentioned a case. He asked once unprompted while we sat in the clinic parking lot waiting for his appointment time, "You doing okay, Mari, really?" And when I hesitated a half-second too long before answering, he just nodded slowly, looked out the windshield rather than at me, giving me the privacy to not have to perform an answer, and said, "That's what I thought." Then he let it go, and we talked about baseball the rest of the way home. I think about that moment a lot now. Frank saw something even then, years before any of this came to a head. He just didn't have the tools or maybe the courage built up over 30 years of a specific family script to say more than that out loud. Escalation arc year 4. By year 4, the ask had a shape I could predict before Bridget even opened her mouth. The way you can tell what a client's spreadsheet is going to show you before you've finished opening the file just from the way the tabs are labeled. There would be a crisis, always plausible on its surface, sometimes genuinely real. There would be a dollar figure that felt, on its own, small enough that refusing would seem disproportionately cruel. And there would be a line, delivered gently, warmly, that did the actual work of the manipulation, doing more heavy lifting than the crisis itself. "Family takes care of family." Or, "You're the strong one, Mari, you don't need it the way I do." Or, my personal least favorite, the one that made something in my chest tight every single time, "I'd never ask if it wasn't important, you know that about me." That year, the total came to $6,300 across 7 separate requests. I know the number exactly because that was the year I finally stopped pretending the private note in my phone was anything other than what it plainly was, a ledger. I stopped calling it paranoia in my own head, in the small hours when I couldn't sleep, and started calling it what my training told me it actually was: documentation. Evidence, even though I wasn't yet ready to think of it in those terms. There was a specific incident in October of that 4th year that I still think about more than almost any other. Daniel and I had planned a 10-year anniversary trip, not our marriage anniversary, our relationship anniversary, from that hotel bar in Denver where it all started to Portugal. $3,200 booked and paid in full 4 months in advance, the first real trip we'd taken since our honeymoon. 9 days before we left, Bridget called in tears because her landlord was starting eviction proceedings over $1,800 in back rent she said had gotten away from her. Daniel, without asking me, without even really discussing it beyond a single guilty text message sent while I was in the shower, pulled the money from what was supposed to be our trip spending fund and wired it to her that same night. We went to Portugal anyway, but we did it on a budget so tight that I remember standing in a beautiful stone courtyard in Porto, surrounded by orange trees and old tilework, doing math in my head instead of actually looking at the view in front of me, calculating whether we could afford the museum we'd planned to visit that afternoon, or whether we needed to save that money for the dinner we'd already booked. I didn't yell at Daniel about it. I want to be honest about that because I know some people watching this would have, and I understand why. I understood even then in that courtyard that Daniel wasn't doing this to hurt me. He was doing it because he'd spent his whole childhood in a house where Bridget's crises were treated as 5-alarm fires requiring instant, unquestioning response, and his own needs were treated as things that could always wait until later. And some part of him, at 39 years old, still genuinely believed that loving his sister meant absorbing whatever came out of her, no matter the cost to himself or by extension to us. What I said to him that night in our small hotel room, quietly sitting on the edge of the bed with the windows open to the sound of the street below, was, "I need you to ask me next time, not tell me after it's already done, ask me before." He said okay. He meant it, I think, genuinely in the moment we were sitting in. Whether that moment held past the flight home was a different question, one I wouldn't get an honest answer to for a while yet. Escalation Arc Year 5. Year 5 brought the first request that came with real numbers attached to it, the kind of paperwork that should have made me suspicious immediately and instead, because it looked so official, made me trust the situation more. In February, Bridget showed me briefly on her phone screen, never offering to send it to me directly, which I noted but didn't yet weigh properly. What she said was a past due notice from a medical billing company for $2,200 related to some tests she'd needed the previous fall. She said her insurance had denied the claim on a technicality and she was appealing it, but the collections deadline was going to hit before the appeal cleared. I gave her the money in 2 installments, $1,100 each, 2 weeks apart, because that was what she said the biller had agreed to as a partial payment plan. I want to tell you about the rationalization I built for myself that year because I think it's the most honest window into how all of this kept working for as long as it did. I told myself, medical debt is not a character flaw. Insurance companies deny legitimate claims constantly. I've read about it, I've seen it happen to people I actually trust. If I refuse to help with something medical and it turns out to be real, I will never forgive myself. That rationalization was airtight emotionally. It was also, I would learn 4 years later, completely detached from what had actually happened, because there had been no medical bill at all, a fact I wouldn't be able to prove until I found the actual paper trail, much later in a moment I'll get to. In August of that same year, there was a smaller request, $350 for car insurance renewal. It went up more than I budgeted for, that I almost didn't write down. It felt so minor compared to the medical bill months earlier. But I did write it down, out of habit by then more than suspicion. And I'm glad I did, because when I finally built the full spreadsheet years later, that unremarkable $350 turned out to be the exact same week Bridget posted, on a social media account I didn't otherwise follow closely, photos from a 4-day trip to Cabo San Lucas with 2 friends. I didn't see those photos at the time. Carol mentioned the trip in passing months later at a birthday dinner, saying how nice it was that Bridget had finally gotten a little break. I remember smiling and agreeing and not connecting the dates in my head until much, much later, when I went back through my own private notes with a different, colder kind of attention than I'd ever let myself use before. A small warmth. Sophie was 3 that year, well into the age of forming real sentences and real opinions, and she developed a habit that I still think about with something close to tenderness. Whenever I came over, she would run to the door before anyone could stop her, arms already reaching up, and announce to the entire room at full toddler volume, "Aunt Mari's here, everybody, Aunt Mari's here," as though I were a celebrity arriving at an event rather than the aunt who came over most Sunday afternoons. At Carol's house one weekend that August, I found Sophie sitting on the living room floor with a set of crayons, working with total furrowed brow concentration on a family portrait for a preschool assignment. There were 6 figures in it: Mommy, Daddy, Bridget's on-again, off-again boyfriend at the time, Grandma, Grandpa, Uncle Daniel, and me, labeled Aunt Mari in crooked, backward-leaning crayon letters, standing next to Daniel, holding a stick-figure dog we didn't actually own. "You don't have a dog," Sophie told me solemnly, handing the drawing over for my approval with the seriousness of an artist unveiling a major work, "but I think you should." I still have that drawing. It's in a drawer in my office, and on the specific days when this story gets heaviest for me to think about, and there were a lot of those days over the years, I take it out and look at it for a minute before I put it carefully back. Escalation Arc Year 6. Year 6 is when I understood for the first time that there were 2 versions of me circulating in this family, and I didn't find out about the second one directly. I found out sideways, the way you usually do, a comment here, a raised eyebrow there, a sentence that didn't quite fit the version of events I remembered living through myself. Carol mentioned, at a birthday dinner for Frank, gently, almost apologetically, that she'd heard I'd been a little cold to Bridget lately. I asked what she meant, genuinely confused, trying to think of anything I might have said or done. Carol looked uncomfortable, glancing briefly toward the kitchen as though checking that Bridget was out of earshot, and said, "Oh, just Bridget's mentioned you seem distant." Distracted, she said, "You didn't even ask how Sophie's recital went." This was strange to me because I remembered asking in a text message the very day of the recital, and Bridget had never replied to it. I didn't argue the point at the table. I just filed it away, the way I file away every inconsistency in a set of books that's supposed to balance and stubbornly doesn't. That was the year I understood there were two versions of me existing in this family at once. There was the me I knew myself to be, steady, generous to a fault, quietly and increasingly exhausted in ways I hadn't fully admitted even to myself. And there was a second me, a character Bridget had apparently been constructing over months and years, in conversations I wasn't present for and couldn't defend myself in. Cold, controlling, always keeping track. Someone who made Daniel choose between his wife and his family. Someone who resented Bridget's very existence in a way I had never once felt or expressed. I heard fragments of this second character over the following months from several different, unconnected directions. From Frank in an unguarded comment about how he hoped things smoothed over between the girls soon. From a cousin at a wedding I barely remembered being invited to, who asked me with genuine sympathetic concern, "Is it true you guys don't really talk anymore?" Once memorably from Sophie's kindergarten teacher of all people, who mentioned in passing during a parent volunteer event that she'd heard from Sophie's aunt that things were a little tense in the family right now. I remember the exact sentence that made the whole shape of it finally click into place for me, all at once like a column of numbers suddenly resolving. At a 4th of July barbecue that year, Bridget's friend Alyssa, someone I barely knew, someone I'd met maybe twice before, said to me not unkindly, almost with genuine sympathy in her voice, "It's brave of you to still come to these things honestly after everything." I asked her as evenly as I could manage what she meant by everything. She looked immediately embarrassed, glancing down at her drink, and said, "Oh, nothing, sorry, I probably have it wrong." She didn't have it wrong. She had exactly what Bridget wanted her to have, delivered exactly the way Bridget wanted it delivered. That's the machinery of it, and I want to name it clearly here the way I'd name a finding in a fraud report with no softening around the edges. Bridget wasn't just asking for money year after year. She was, at the same time, quietly and patiently pre-narrating the story of any future refusal, long before she ever needed to use it. If I ever said no, if I ever became the strong one who stopped being strong on command, who stopped absorbing whatever needed absorbing, the story was already in place, fully built, distributed in small pieces to enough people to explain it away before I'd even said the word. Mari's cold. Mari keeps score. Mari never really felt like family, not really, not underneath it. She built the alibi years before she needed it, one small, sympathetic, seemingly offhand comment at a time to people who would never think to check any of it against the actual truth, because why would they? Nobody audits a feeling. Nobody asks for receipts on a vibe. Escalation arc year 7. Year 7 is when the requests started moving through Daniel more than through me directly. A shift I noticed almost immediately and understood eventually as a strategic response to the fact that I'd started quietly asking more questions. In February, Bridget asked Daniel for $700 for Sophie's dance recital costume and fees, a phrase I would remember specifically later because it closely mirrored the school fund language that would come to matter so much more. In June, she asked him for $1,000 in cash this time for reasons she described only as something private. "Please don't make me explain it in front of Mari, it's embarrassing." Daniel gave her the cash. He told me about it 3 days later, almost as an afterthought, mentioned in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. And I remember the specific sinking feeling of realizing that, "Please don't make me explain it in front of Mari," had become its own kind of currency in this family. A phrase that let Bridget access money while quietly repositioning me. Again, as the obstacle, the one who couldn't be trusted with the full picture, the one whose presence in a room required an explanation to be withheld rather than given. I sat Daniel down after that one calmly, the way I try to approach everything, and said, "I'm not upset that you helped your sister. I'm telling you that when she asks you to keep something from me specifically, that's not a private matter between siblings anymore. That's a wedge, whether she means it as one or not, and I need you to see the difference." Daniel nodded. He said he understood. I believed in that moment that he did. In September of that year, there was a request that I now recognize with the full clarity of hindsight as a kind of rehearsal for the school fund deception that would come to define so much of what I discovered later. Bridget asked me directly for $900. Specifically and repeatedly described as being for Sophie's after-school program, the one with the good teacher-to-kid ratio. It's a little pricier, but it's worth it for her. I paid the after-school program directly myself that time, writing the check straight to the facility rather than handing Bridget cash, mostly out of habit from my professional life rather than any specific suspicion. It was the first time I'd done that. When I mentioned it to Bridget, expecting her to be pleased that I'd handled the payment efficiently, her reaction was oddly sharp, quick, almost defensive before she caught herself and smoothed it over. "Oh, I mean, sure, that's fine. I just usually handle that stuff myself." Is all. I noted the reaction in my private log that night, the way you note a data point that doesn't fit the model yet but that you suspect will matter eventually. Sept 11, $900 paid directly to program B's reaction to direct payment. Sharp, then smoothed over. Why? I wouldn't get the full answer to that question for 2 more years, but I never forgot having asked it. A small warmth. I want to give you one more warmth here because year 7, for all its quiet unease, also held one of the moments I treasure most from this entire story. Sophie was 6 that autumn, newly obsessed with a series of books about a detective mouse who solved small mysteries in a bakery. And for her birthday that year, instead of a toy, she specifically asked me, not her parents, me, to take her to the actual public library downtown, the big one with the reading room and the tall windows, so she could get her own library card like a real grown-up. I took the entire afternoon off work for it. We sat at a long wooden table in that reading room for almost 2 hours while she worked her way through the first 3 books in the series, occasionally looking up to report a plot development to me with total, breathless seriousness, as though I hadn't already read the books myself years before as an adult, purely so I'd be able to discuss them with her properly. On the drive home, unprompted from the back seat, she said, "You're my favorite grown-up, don't tell Mom." I told her that seemed like an unfair thing to ask me to keep from her mother. She thought about that for a moment with real consideration, the way she thought about everything, and then said, "Okay, you can tell her." I just don't want it to be weird. I still laugh thinking about that, a 6-year-old already anticipating and trying to manage the specific brand of weirdness that lived quietly underneath her family's surface, long before she had any language for what it actually was. Escalation arc year 8. Year 8 is when the dollar figures stopped being small enough to wave away without real conversation, and when the pattern accelerated in a way that, looking back, I think reflected something shifting in Bridget's actual financial life, something getting genuinely worse underneath the surface story she kept telling. In March, Bridget asked for $4,000, framed as a short-term bridge loan against an inheritance she said was coming from a great-aunt's estate, Great-Aunt Louisa, a real person, whose real estate I would later quietly confirm existed and was in fact moving through probate, though the timeline Bridget gave for the payout kept sliding further and further out every time I asked about it. From a few months to hopefully by summer to eventually a vague shrug and a change of subject. In August, she asked for another $2,200, this time explicitly, repeatedly, for Sophie's school fund, a phrase that would come to matter enormously later, a phrase I would eventually learn had almost nothing to do with the actual cost of Sophie's actual schooling. In November, she asked Daniel directly, bypassing me entirely for what I believe was the first time in years, for $1,800 in cash, no explanation given beyond, "Trust me, it's important," and Daniel gave it to her before mentioning a word of it to me at all. That was the first time I said something close to sharp to my husband in 9 years of marriage. Not shouting, I want to be clear, I never shouted at anyone in this entire story, not once, and I'm proud of that, but sharp in the sense of precise, direct, and unwilling to soften the edges of what I was saying. I sat Daniel down at our kitchen table one evening and said, "I'm not angry that you helped your sister. I want you to hear that clearly. I'm telling you that I found out about $1,800 leaving our joint account from a bank notification on my phone, not from you, 3 days after it happened. That's not a marriage anymore, Daniel. That's a household with a leak in it that only one of us is trying to find." Daniel apologized. He meant it, I do believe, even now looking back with everything I know, that he meant it every single time he said it. But there was a pattern underneath his apologies that I'd started to recognize by then too, a pattern I could name even if I couldn't yet fix it. He wasn't just protecting Bridget when he did these things. He was protecting the story that his family didn't have a problem, because admitting the problem meant admitting that 39 years of the sensitive one and the steady one had been a script the whole family performed, not an honest description of two different people, and some part of him wasn't ready to tear that script up in front of everyone, including himself. Not yet, not that year. That year, the total came to just over $11,000. I know because I wrote it down, every entry with dates. Escalation arc, the coworker connection begins. There's one more incident from year 8 I need to tell you about before we get to the envelope, because it's the first thread of something that wouldn't fully unravel for another 2 years, and I want you to have it in the right place in the timeline, the way I eventually had to reconstruct it myself. In late October of that year, at the office holiday mixer our firm throws every autumn, technically a harvest social, though nobody has ever called it that. Unironically, a woman from our marketing department named Denise approached me near the drinks table and mentioned warmly, almost as small talk, that she'd loved getting to help out a little with something for my family recently. I had no idea what she meant. I smiled and nodded the way you do when you're trying to buy yourself a second to catch up to a conversation, and asked her as casually as I could manage to remind me what she'd helped with. "Oh, your sister-in-law reached out a while back," Denise said, sipping her drink entirely unbothered, clearly assuming I already knew. "Said you guys were coordinating something for a family thing and asked if I wanted to chip in. It was only like $50, no big deal. I just felt bad for her. She seemed really stressed about it." I remember the specific, cold clarity of that moment, standing near a table of cheese cubes and cheap wine, smiling and thanking Denise for her generosity while some part of my mind quietly, methodically filed the information away. Bridget had reached a coworker of mine directly, using my name as a kind of credential for a request I knew nothing about. I didn't confront Bridget about it that week. I told myself, the way I'd told myself so many things by then, that it was probably a misunderstanding, that Denise had probably gotten some detail confused, that I shouldn't leap to the worst possible interpretation over $50. But I wrote it down. And 2 years later, when I finally built the full spreadsheet, that $50 from Denise turned out to be the first documented transaction on the Venmo account that carried my name. The account I wouldn't discover existed until that Sunday night with the estate attorney's email sitting open in front of me. Denise's $50 was, in a very real sense, where all of it actually began. The envelope. Here's a detail I have to give you now because it becomes important later, and I promised myself, sitting down to tell you this story, that I wouldn't build it around a twist I hadn't planted honestly along the way. The way a good audit trail should always let you retrace every step backward. In September of that 8th year, I was helping Carol sort through some old filing cabinets in her garage. She was downsizing, preparing to move into a smaller condo closer to Frank's cardiologist, and I came across a resealed envelope, the kind with the little metal clasp tucked into a folder of old tax documents, labeled in Carol's careful, looping handwriting. "B. School Fund, do not open until NEDED." I didn't open it. I want that on the record clearly, because everything that happened later depended on the fact that I am not, and have never been, the kind of person who goes digging through other people's mail out of idle curiosity. I just noted it the way I noted everything by then, filed it away in the back of my mind alongside all the other small, unexplained inconsistencies, and put it back exactly where I'd found it, underneath the same folder at the same angle, and didn't think about it again, not really, for 2 more years. I'm telling you about it now because when I finally understood what was actually inside that envelope 2 years later, it explained 9 years of my life in about 4 seconds. A longer look back, what Daniel never told me. There's a piece of this story that belongs here in the space right before everything changed, because I didn't learn it until much later, and because it reframed 9 years of watching Daniel absorb his sister's chaos without complaint. Late in that 8th year, on a night when neither of us could sleep, Daniel told me something about his childhood he'd never told me before, not in 11 years together. When he was 14 and Bridget was 11, their parents had gone through a rough financial stretch. Frank had lost a job in a round of layoffs, and for about 8 months, money in the house was genuinely, seriously tight. Daniel remembered being told quietly by Carol that he understood these things better than Bridget did, that he was old enough to be mature about it, and that he shouldn't mention to Bridget how bad things actually were because she got anxious easily and it wasn't fair to put that on her. So Daniel, at 14, quietly gave up a summer camp he'd been looking forward to for a year, told his friends he just didn't feel like going, and never said a word to his little sister about why the house felt different that year. Bridget, at 11, was shielded from all of it, went to camp herself that same summer on a scholarship Carol had quietly arranged without telling Daniel where the money for the remaining balance had actually come from. I don't think I ever resented her for it exactly, Daniel told me that night, staring at the ceiling. I think I just learned really young that my job in that house was to make things easier for everyone else, and that doing it quietly was somehow better than doing it out loud. I never even thought about it as a rule until right now, saying it to you. I didn't say much in response. I just held his hand in the dark and let him keep talking because I understood, hearing it, that I wasn't only watching a pattern between Daniel and Bridget play out over 9 years. I was watching the tail end of something that had started when they were children, something neither of them had ever had the vocabulary to name until a spreadsheet finally forced the vocabulary into the room. Escalation arc, the pattern named. I want to pause the chronology here just briefly before we move into the discovery itself, because there's a version of this story where I skip straight from 9 years of small requests to the email that changed everything, and that skip would flatten something important. The sheer, grinding ordinariness of how normal all of this had started to feel to me by the 9th year. By then, I had developed what I can only describe as a kind of internal weather system around Bridget's name appearing on my phone. A specific tightening in my chest when I saw her contact photo pop up, a half-second of bracing before I answered, a private, automatic calculation running somewhere in the back of my mind before she'd even finished her first sentence. How much this time, and what will the reason be? I hated that I had that reflex. I hated it more because I couldn't make it go away just by wanting to. I want to name something else here too because it matters and because I think it's the part of this story that other people living through something similar might recognize most. The exhausting part was never really the money itself, not primarily. Daniel and I could absorb $31,000 over 9 years without it meaningfully touching our long-term security, and I want to be honest about that privilege because it's part of why I said yes as many times as I did. The cost never hit hard enough on its own to force the question. The exhausting part was the performance underneath it. The requirement every single time that I participate in a story I could feel wasn't quite true, that I smile and nod and hand over the money and never once say out loud the thing I was actually thinking, which was simply, I don't believe you, not entirely, and I hate that I'm helping anyway because the alternative is being the villain in a story I never agreed to be cast in. That's the machinery named plainly one more time because I think it bears repeating in its own right, separate from any single incident. A family that needs you to keep believing an unlikely story isn't actually asking for your money. It's asking for your silence dressed up as generosity, and it will keep asking for exactly as long as you keep supplying it.